Her family kicked her out in the rain at their reunion, until her husband arrived in a private jet. Before we dive into today's story, kindly hit the subscribe button and turn on the notification bell, so you won't miss more powerful stories like this. Now to my story. Imagine being thrown out by your own family, humiliated in the pouring rain, only to rise again in the most unexpected way. This is Eleanor's journey, a story of betrayal, heartbreak, and the sweetest twist of fate. The evening sky was heavy with gray clouds, and the Edwards family estate buzzed with chatter as relatives gathered for the annual reunion. Laughter echoed under the decorated canopy, glasses clinked with wine, and the aroma of grilled food carried through the air. But amid the warmth of togetherness, one figure stood apart. Eleanor, a quiet woman whose presence had never been welcomed as warmly as others. Eleanor arrived in her modest blue dress, carrying only a small handbag and a polite smile. She had hoped, just for once, to blend into the sea of relatives without whispers or stares. But almost as soon as she stepped into the yard, sharp eyes turned her way. Her cousin Margaret was the first to sneer. "Well, look who decided to show up," she muttered loudly enough for others to hear. A few chuckles followed, though Eleanor remained calm, her lips pressed into a faint smile that betrayed nothing of the storm brewing inside her. For years, Eleanor had been seen as the outsider of the family. She married young, not to wealth but to love, and that alone had made her the subject of ridicule. Her relatives, especially the ones who built their lives around titles and appearances, treated her as though she carried a permanent stain. They remembered every failure, every setback, and conveniently ignored her resilience. Tonight was no different. The reunion began with a toast inside the large hall, where the long tables glittered with polished cutlery and crystal glasses. Eleanor followed quietly, sitting at the far end. Yet no matter how she tried to keep to herself, the family's disdain followed. One uncle leaned over and whispered to another, "Why does she even bother coming here? She doesn't belong." A cousin snapped her fingers at Eleanor, demanding she clear a chair, as though she were staff instead of kin. When the rain began outside, pouring hard against the glass windows, the air inside the hall grew tense. Margaret stood abruptly, her wine glass clutched tightly. "You know," she announced with false sweetness, "there's really no room here for people who don't understand what family honor means. Some of us actually work to uphold our name." Her gaze landed squarely on Eleanor. A hush fell over the hall. Eleanor's chair scraped softly as she stood, her hands steady though her heart raced. Before she could speak, Margaret pointed toward the door. "If you want to eat, do it outside. Some of us would like to enjoy dinner without distractions." The words stung sharper than the rain outside. Eleanor swallowed hard, her eyes glistening, but she did not plead. She simply gathered her handbag and walked quietly toward the door. As the rain lashed down in heavy sheets, she stepped out into the cold night air. The downpour soaked her within seconds, plastering her curls to her face and clinging her blue dress to her skin. From inside, the family barely flinched. A few averted their eyes, while others snickered at the sight of Eleanor standing drenched under the storm. The hall, filled with bright light and laughter, now seemed like another world compared to the darkness where Eleanor stood alone. Her chest ached, not from the rain, but from the familiar weight of rejection. Yet, even as she trembled from the chill, she held her head high. For years they had tried to break her spirit, and for years she had endured. This night would be no different. She whispered to herself through the rain, "I may be outside, but I am not beneath them." At that moment, distant thunder rolled across the sky, as if echoing her quiet defiance. None of them inside could see it yet, but destiny was already on its way. The rain fell harder, drumming against the pavement in relentless sheets. Eleanor stood silently in the storm, her figure framed by the dim glow of the estate's porch lights. Inside, the Edwards family resumed their dinner as if nothing had happened. Cutlery scraped against plates, wine poured freely, and shallow conversations filled the hall. They pretended she was invisible, but the world outside their narrow view was about to shift. Far above the clouds, A sleek private jet cut through the storm, its engines humming steadily as it began its descent. Inside sat Alexander Whitmore, Eleanor's husband, a man whose name carried weight in business circles and beyond. Tall, composed, with sharp blue eyes that rarely missed detail, Alexander had built his empire from the ground up. Yet despite his wealth, he never flaunted it, except when it came to defending the woman he loved. That evening, he had been away on business, unaware of how cruelly his wife had been treated. But the moment Eleanor's quiet message reached him, just 5 words, "They made me stand outside," he left everything behind. As the jet touched down at the nearest private airstrip, his driver stood ready, the sleek black car purring at the curb. "Straight to the Edwards estate," Alexander instructed firmly, his voice carrying no trace of hesitation. Within minutes, they sped down the wet roads, rain streaking across the windshield, headlights slicing through the dark. Back at the estate, Eleanor wrapped her arms around herself, the cold biting through her soaked blue dress. The laughter inside grew louder, almost mocking, but she refused to cry. She had learned long ago that tears only gave her family more fuel for their cruelty. Instead, she stood with quiet dignity, her curls plastered to her shoulders, her face pale but resolute. Then a low rumble filled the air. Not thunder this time, but the unmistakable roar of engines. Heads turned toward the windows as brilliant beams of light swept across the driveway. Gasps rippled through the hall as the sleek black car rolled up, water spraying dramatically from the tires. The driver leapt out, umbrella in hand, and opened the rear door. Out stepped Alexander, tall and commanding, his dark overcoat whipping slightly in the wind. He scanned the scene once, his sharp gaze taking in the sight of his wife, drenched and shivering in the rain, while her family sat warm and comfortable inside. His jaw tightened. Without hesitation, he strode through the downpour and reached Eleanor. She looked up at him, her eyes wide with relief, though she said nothing. He placed the umbrella over her, shielding her at once, and gently removed his coat to drape it over her shoulders. His voice was low, almost tender. "You should never have been left out here." Inside the hall, silence fell like a heavy curtain. Every fork froze midair, every laugh died instantly. The Edwards family, who had so casually dismissed Eleanor, now found themselves staring at the man they had underestimated for years. Alexander's reputation preceded him. They knew his power, his influence, and the fact that he had never once bowed to anyone. He turned toward the doorway, his eyes locking with Margaret's. Though he didn't raise his voice, his words carried an icy weight. "Tell me, who decided my wife wasn't worthy to sit at her own family's table?" Margaret's smugness crumbled. Her lips parted, but no sound came. A few relatives shifted uncomfortably, avoiding his gaze, their confidence melting away under his presence. Alexander didn't wait for an answer. He placed his hand firmly on Eleanor's back and guided her toward the car. The warmth of the interior swallowed her instantly, a stark contrast to the bitter cold she had endured outside. As the door closed, he gave one last look at the hall of stunned faces. "Remember this," he said evenly, his tone like polished steel. "The woman you cast aside is the one I treasure above all. And tonight you will answer to your own shame." Then he entered the car beside Eleanor, and as the engine roared to life, the Edwards family stood frozen, watching the vehicle disappear into the rain-swept night. For the first time in years, Eleanor felt the ache in her chest ease. She hadn't needed saving, but in that moment Alexander's presence wasn't just rescue, it was vindication. The Edwards estate was never truly quiet, but that night, after Alexander's departure, silence hung heavy across its walls. The rain still beat against the windows, but inside, no one dared to speak first. Wine glasses sat half-empty, plates untouched. Margaret's hand trembled slightly as she placed her fork down. Her earlier smugness vanished like smoke. The cousins who had laughed the loudest during Eleanor's humiliation now stared at their laps, their faces pale. A few exchanged nervous glances, as if silently asking each other the same question. What have we done? Margaret finally broke the silence, her voice sharp but uncertain. She was always too proud, acting like she was better than us. Maybe this will humble her. Yet even as she spoke, the words sounded hollow. Deep down, she knew it wasn't Eleanor who had been humbled. It was them. Across the room, Aunt Florence muttered under her breath. Did you see the way he looked at us? Like we were insects. Her hands fidgeted with her napkin, twisting it over and over again. He owns half the companies in this county, one of the uncles said nervously, shifting in his chair. If Alexander Whitmore decides we're not worth the air we breathe, we're finished. The realization struck them all at once. For years, they had dismissed Eleanor as the quiet, unwanted daughter who never quite fit their polished family image. She had been the target of ridicule at gatherings, the scapegoat for their gossip. They never thought she mattered, not in comparison to them. But standing drenched in the rain while her husband arrived in a private jet had shifted the balance of power entirely. Suddenly, she mattered more than all of them combined. Margaret pressed a hand to her temple, pacing the length of the dining hall. We can't let this story spread, she whispered, panic creeping into her tone. If anyone hears about this, it will ruin our reputation. Her brother scoffed, though the bravado didn't quite reach his eyes. Reputation. Margaret, we kicked her out into a storm. Her husband had to come in a jet to collect her. Do you not see? We look like villains in some cheap novel. The cousins burst into nervous laughter, the kind of laughter that came not from humor but from fear. The image of Alexander standing tall in the storm, his voice carrying that quiet fury, replayed in their minds like a nightmare they couldn't shake. One of the younger nieces asked softly, Do you think Eleanor will forgive us? Her innocence cut through the room like glass. No one answered. They all knew forgiveness was the last thing they deserved. Meanwhile, in the car speeding through the rain, Eleanor leaned her head against the seat, exhaustion washing over her. Alexander glanced at her, his hand brushing against hers. They will regret tonight, he said firmly. She gave him a faint smile, but her voice carried no malice when she replied, They already do. Back at the estate, Margaret finally sank into her chair, staring at the untouched feast. She thought of the way Eleanor had stood in the rain, not broken, not begging, but dignified even in humiliation. For the first time, Margaret realized it wasn't Eleanor who had been powerless all these years. It was them, hiding behind wealth and appearances, while she had carried herself with strength. Regret began to spread among them like a disease, seeping into every silence, every nervous glance, every whispered word. They had thought casting her out was an act of control. Instead, it became the moment they lost all power over her forever. Eleanor awoke the next morning to the quiet hum of the city outside their penthouse suite. Sunlight streamed through the tall glass windows, casting golden patterns across the room. For the first time in years, she felt a strange calm settle inside her chest, as though the storm had washed away something heavy she had carried for far too long. Alexander sat near the window, already dressed in a crisp navy suit, sipping his coffee while scrolling through his tablet. He looked up as she stirred, his expression softening. You slept well, he observed gently. Eleanor stretched, the weight of the previous night still pressing on her mind. I did, she admitted. But I keep thinking about them. The looks on their faces when you arrived. They weren't angry anymore. They were afraid. He set the tablet aside and walked to her, taking her hands in his. Let them be afraid, he said firmly. For once in your life, Eleanor, you don't need to carry the burden of their cruelty. You owe them nothing. The words lingered in the air, heavy but liberating. For years she had sought their approval. Her mother's sharp tongue, her relatives' disdain, their constant comparisons. She had tried to prove her worth with kindness, with patience, with silence. But last night had proven something she had never dared believe. Her worth had never been theirs to define. Later that morning, Alexander suggested they go for a walk. The city streets bustled with life. Taxis rushing, vendors calling, people weaving through the sidewalks, but Eleanor moved through it with a newfound steadiness. Strangers glanced at them, some recognizing Alexander, others simply seeing a woman by his side. But for once she didn't feel small. She didn't feel invisible. As they paused near a cafe, Alexander touched her shoulder lightly. "You know," he said, his tone carrying a playful edge, "if you wanted, we could throw a reunion of our own. Invite the people who truly matter." Eleanor laughed softly, the sound surprising even herself. "Imagine that," she murmured, picturing a gathering filled with genuine warmth instead of judgment. Her laughter carried a quiet strength, and Alexander noticed it. He smiled, but deep down he felt something more: pride. Not pride in his wealth or power, but in her resilience. She had been pushed down, humiliated, cast aside, yet she still stood tall. Back at the Edwards estate, the regret festered. Margaret had spent the morning making frantic calls, trying to reach Eleanor, trying to undo what had already been done. But Eleanor didn't answer. For the first time, she wasn't the one waiting by the phone. That evening, Eleanor sat on the balcony of their suite, sketchbook resting on her lap, the city lights glowing beneath her. She had always loved to draw. It had been her quiet escape since childhood, but her family mocked it, calling it useless. Now, with each line she traced across the page, she felt like she was reclaiming a piece of herself. Alexander joined her, leaning against the railing. "What are you drawing?" he asked. She held it up for him to see. A sketch of a lone figure standing in the rain, her chin lifted high as a storm raged around her. "It's me," Eleanor said softly. "Last night. But not broken. Not anymore." He kissed her hair, his voice low but sure. "Exactly. And that's who they'll remember. Not the woman they mocked, but the woman who walked away stronger." Eleanor smiled faintly, turning back to her sketch. For the first time in years, she wasn't thinking about how to fit into her family's world. She was building her own. The storm had not destroyed her. It had revealed her strength. 2 weeks passed before Eleanor heard from her family again. Letters arrived first, carefully written, dripping with apologies. Margaret's neat handwriting filled one page. "I was wrong. We were all wrong. That night I acted out of pride and tradition, but I forgot compassion. Please forgive me. Please come home." Eleanor read it slowly, then set it aside. The wound was still fresh, and apologies written on paper did little to erase the sting of standing in the rain while her family laughed. The calls came next. Her brother James left a voicemail, his voice heavy with shame. "Eleanor, I don't even know how to begin. We treated you like an outsider, like you weren't good enough. But when Alexander's jet landed and the world turned to look at you, not us, I realized what we had done. We pushed away the best of us." Eleanor sat with Alexander that night, replaying the message. She stared out at the glittering skyline, her thoughts tangled. "Why now?" she whispered. "Why do they only see my worth when someone else shines a light on it?" Alexander placed a steady hand over hers. "Because people blinded by pride never see clearly until they are forced to. Their regret is not your responsibility. You owe them no explanation." And yet, a part of Eleanor still longed for closure. She had carried their rejection for too long, and though she no longer needed their approval, she wanted them to understand she was no longer the girl who bowed her head in silence. A week later, the Edwards family hosted another gathering, this time a smaller dinner. An invitation arrived for Eleanor, hand-delivered, embossed, with her name printed in elegant script. For a moment, she almost tossed it aside. But then she smiled. "No," she said. "This time I'll go. Not to seek their love, but to show them who I am now." When she entered the grand dining hall that evening, heads turned. She wore a simple yet elegant black dress, her curls falling freely across her shoulders. Alexander walked beside her, not as a shield but as a partner. The room fell silent, as though everyone was holding their breath. Margaret rose from her seat, tears already forming. Eleanor, she began, her voice trembling. I don't expect forgiveness. But please know we regret every word, every action. You deserved better from us. Eleanor looked around the room, at faces once filled with scorn now softened by shame. She inhaled deeply, steadying herself. You were right about one thing, she said evenly. I didn't belong here, not because I wasn't enough, but because I was too much for the small box you tried to put me in. I begged for your acceptance once. I will never beg again. Silence gripped the hall, broken only by the quiet sound of Alexander pulling out her chair. She sat, her posture regal, her presence undeniable. For the first time in her life, she wasn't the outsider in the room. She was the center. The dinner went on quietly after that, her relatives careful with their words, their eyes lowered in respect. By the end of the night, Eleanor realized she no longer needed to wait for their approval. Their regret was theirs to bear, not hers to mend. As she and Alexander stepped into their car, he turned to her with a smile. You didn't just walk into that room, you owned it. Eleanor's lips curved into a soft smile. I guess, she said, looking out at the night sky, that's what happens when you finally choose yourself. From that day forward she lived without apology. Her family would always carry the memory of the night they left her in the rain, only to watch her rise higher than they ever imagined. And Eleanor, she would carry something far greater, peace. And so, Eleanor's story reminds us of something deeply powerful. Sometimes the people who should love us the most are the ones who fail us the hardest. But strength isn't found in begging for a seat at their table. It's found in building your own, with dignity and peace. What do you think? Was Eleanor right to walk away, or should she have forgiven her family sooner? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. If this story touched you, don't forget to hit the like button, subscribe, and share it with someone who needs to be reminded of their worth. Thank you for watching, and until next time, choose peace, choose dignity, and most importantly, choose yourself.